12 months after burying my son, a $523 electricity bill showed up from his supposedly abandoned farm. That night, I drove out there in the freezing snow. From about 200 meters away, I saw an SUV parked in the yard and thick smoke rising from the chimney. What I saw next left me absolutely stunned. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to uncover a painful truth to protect your family. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old. For 40 years, I worked as a commercial construction contractor building foundations, pouring concrete, and managing heavy industrial sites. I spent my entire life working with my hands and my head calculating loads, electrical currents, and structural limits. I built a good, comfortable life so my family would always be secure. When my son Matthew died in a horrific car crash a year ago, my entire world collapsed. I thought I would never recover from the pain of burying my own boy. I thought the worst day of my life was already behind me. I was wrong. It started on a quiet Tuesday evening in late November. The upstate New York winter was just beginning to bite, sending bitter winds howling against the windows of my house. I was sitting at my kitchen table drinking a cup of black coffee and sorting through a pile of forwarded junk mail. Most of it was meaningless flyers and credit card offers. But then my hands stopped moving. There was a thin, white envelope. The return address read, New York State Electric and Gas. The recipient name printed on the front sent a sharp, agonizing ache straight through my chest. It was addressed to Matthew Cole. The mail from his old property had been forwarded to my address ever since the accident. His farm, a sprawling piece of land out in the rural countryside, had been locked up and completely abandoned for 12 solid months. Rachel, my daughter-in-law, had told me she simply could not bear to go back there. She said it held too many painful memories, so she padlocked the gates, shut off the main valves, and left it to the elements until she felt ready to sell it. I stared at the envelope for a long time. Usually an abandoned property might draw a tiny service fee, maybe $10 or $15 a month, just to keep the meter active. I slid my thumb under the flap and tore it open, expecting a nominal charge. I pulled out the paper, adjusted my reading glasses, and looked at the total due. $523.40. For a moment, I just sat there in the quiet kitchen, letting the numbers process in my mind. In my 40 years of construction and property management, you learn exactly what numbers mean. You cannot run up a $500 electric bill on a property that is sitting empty in the dark. A forgotten porch light might cost you a few dollars. A refrigerator left plugged in might cost $20. But $523, that is not a clerical error. That is the footprint of heavy sustained power usage. That is the kind of power draw you see when industrial machinery is running day and night. My chest tightened. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. My grief momentarily stepped aside, instantly replaced by the sharp, analytical instincts of a man who spent his life solving problems on job sites. I did not call Rachel to ask her about it. I did not call the electric company to complain about a faulty meter. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed my heavy winter coat from the rack by the door, snatched my truck keys off the counter, and walked out into the freezing night. The wind hit me immediately, carrying thick flakes of snow that stung my face, but I barely felt the cold. I climbed into my truck, turned the ignition, and threw it into drive. The farm was located about 40 minutes outside of town, situated at the end of a long, winding dirt road surrounded by dense pine trees. The drive felt like an eternity. The rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers clearing the heavy snow matched the anxious beating of my heart. My mind raced through endless possibilities. Were there squatters? Had someone broken in and set up a camp? Or was it something else? Every mile brought a new wave of dread, mixing with the lingering grief of losing Matthew. As I turned onto the final stretch of the rural highway leading to the property line, I made a calculated decision. I did not drive all the way up to the main gate. If there was someone trespassing on my dead son's property, I did not want to announce my arrival with blazing headlights and the loud roar of an engine. I pulled my truck off onto a narrow, hidden logging trail about 200 meters away from the main entrance. I turned off the engine, killed the lights, and sat in the total darkness for a moment, listening to the wind howling through the pines. I reached into the glove compartment and pulled out my heavy-duty binoculars. Stepping out of the truck, the snow crunched loudly beneath my boots. The air was absolutely freezing, biting through my thick coat, but my focus was entirely on the farm at the end of the road. I walked slowly and carefully through the tree line, using the shadows of the woods to mask my approach. When I finally reached a vantage point that gave me a clear view of the property, I raised the binoculars to my eyes and adjusted the focus dial. The breath caught in my throat. The farm was not abandoned, not even close. The main house was dark, but the massive corrugated steel woodshop, located at the back of the property, was completely lit up. Bright, harsh industrial lights spilled out from the edges of the heavy metal doors. And then I saw it. Thick, dark smoke was billowing continuously from the exhaust chimney of the shop. Someone was running the heavy-duty wood stove inside, keeping the massive space warm. I lowered the binoculars for a second, rubbing my eyes, thinking the blowing snow was playing tricks on my vision. I raised them again. My hands began to shake, and it was not from the freezing temperature. Parked directly in front of the illuminated woodshop, sitting heavy and silent in the falling snow, was a vehicle. It was a black Ford Explorer. I zoomed in close, focusing past the falling snowflakes, my eyes locked onto the rear bumper. I stared at the custom license plate. The letters and numbers burned themselves into my memory. My stomach dropped into a bottomless pit. I felt physically sick, as if all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the freezing winter air. It was exactly the same make, the exact same model, and it bore the exact same custom license plates as the vehicle my son had been driving on the night he died. The police reports, the insurance adjusters, the paramedics, they had all told me Matthew's car was completely crushed, a mangled wreck of steel that had to be sold for scrap metal. Yet here it was, sitting perfectly intact, running hot enough that I could see the faint wisp of exhaust curling from the tailpipe into the freezing night air. I stood frozen in this tree line, the snow accumulating on my shoulders. How was this possible? Was I losing my mind? Had the grief finally pushed me over the edge into hallucinations? I took a step forward, my heavy boots crunching loudly in the deep snow, determined to march down there and tear those barn doors open. I needed to know who was inside. I needed to know why my dead son's vehicle was parked at his supposedly abandoned farm. I took another step, the anger rising hot and sharp in my chest, completely overriding my fear. But before my foot could even hit the ground again, a sudden sharp vibration startled me. In the dead, silent isolation of the snowy woods, the buzzing of the cell phone in my coat pocket felt as loud as a siren. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. I quickly scrambled, shoving my cold, trembling hand deep into my pocket to silence the noise before whoever was in that barn could hear it. I pulled the phone out, shielding the bright glare of the screen with my other hand. I looked down at the caller ID, expecting it to be a telemarketer or a wrong number. The name flashing brightly on the screen made my blood run absolutely cold. It was Rachel. My daughter-in-law was calling me at 2 a.m, right at the exact moment I was standing in the dark, staring at my dead son's ghost car. I scrambled backward into the thick protective cover of the pine trees, my boots sinking deep into the powdery snow. My aging heart hammered wildly against my cold ribs. The phone vibrated relentlessly in my hand, threatening to give away my position in the dead silence of the winter woods. I quickly pressed the answer button and brought the frozen device to my ear, forcing myself to steady my breathing. "Hello?" I answered, my voice coming out slightly rougher than I originally intended. "Dad," Rachel said. Her voice was thick with heavy tears, trembling with what sounded like absolute devastation. "I am so sorry to call you this late. I could not sleep. I keep staring endlessly at the clock." I swallowed hard, the freezing cold air burning my throat. "It is all right, Rachel. What is wrong?" "It is past midnight," she whispered, her voice breaking into a soft sob. It is officially the anniversary, a whole year since Matthew left us. I just felt so incredibly alone and I needed to hear your voice. You are the only one who truly understands this specific pain. A year ago, those words would have shattered me. I would have wept with her offering every ounce of comfort a father could give to his grieving daughter-in-law. But standing there in the freezing dark, staring at a running vehicle that was supposed to be a crushed cube of scrap metal, her tears felt different. They felt strategic. I needed to test the waters. I needed to see how deep the deception really went. I miss him too, sweetheart, I said, keeping my tone perfectly measured and warm. I was actually thinking about him tonight. In fact, I was sorting through some of the mail that got forwarded from the farm. A strange bill came in from the electric company today. The line went completely silent. It was only for a fraction of a second, but a man who has spent 40 years negotiating difficult contracts knows exactly what a defensive pause sounds like. A bill? Rachel asked, her voice recovering its trembling innocence almost immediately. From the farm? That must be some sort of mistake or just a basic service charge. That is what I thought, I replied smoothly, leaning against the rough bark of a pine tree to steady myself. But it was not a base charge. It was for $523. That is a massive amount of power for a property that has been locked up and empty for a year. I was worried someone might have broken in and set up a camp. I was even thinking about calling the local sheriff to go take a close look. "Oh no, please, do not do that," she said quickly. The urgency in her tone was unmistakable. Then she released a long, shaky sigh, playing the role of a burdened widow flawlessly. "I am sorry, Dad. I should have told you. I hired a local caretaker a few months ago. His name is Greg. You know how brutal the winters get up there in the county. The temperature drops so fast, and I was terrified the main water pipes would freeze and burst. That would completely ruin the entire foundation and the walls." It sounded incredibly logical. Upstate New York winters were notoriously unforgiving, and burst pipes could easily cause tens of thousands of dollars in massive water damage. So, Rachel continued, her voice gaining confidence, I pay Greg to go out there a few nights a week. He turns on the industrial space heaters and runs the heavy-duty water pumps just to keep the lines clear and the property warm. The machinery draws a lot of power, which explains the high bill. I just wanted to preserve the place until I am emotionally ready to put it on the market. I did not want to bother you with the complicated financial details. I watched the thick smoke continuing to billow from the woodshop chimney. A caretaker running heaters did not need a roaring fire at 2 a.m. But I played along, nodding in the darkness, even though she could not actually see me. That makes sense, I said gently. It is smart to protect the property value. But Rachel, there was also a notice from the Department of Motor Vehicles mixed in with the mail. It was a registration renewal for a black Ford Explorer. Matthew's car was completely totaled in the wreck. Why would there be an active registration sent directly to the farm? This time, the silence on the other end lasted longer. When she finally spoke, she let out a loud, agonizing cry that echoed through the phone speaker. It was a masterpiece of pure emotional manipulation. I am so embarrassed. She wept, her words tumbling out between heavy gasps for air. I could not let it go, Dad. I received the life insurance payout a few months ago, and my therapist suggested I find healthy ways to cope. But I was driving past a dealership, and I saw it. It was the exact same year, the exact same model, the exact same black paint as Matthew's car. I bought it in cash. I even paid to have the custom vehicle license plates transferred. She paused to blow her nose, painting a vivid picture of a woman drowning in sorrow. I know it sounds completely crazy. I know it is unhealthy. But sometimes I just sit in the driver's seat and close my eyes and I pretend he is still here. I could not bear to keep it in my driveway in the city where my neighbors would ask questions. So I parked it up at the farm. I let Greg the caretaker use it to haul firewood and supplies when he is actively working on the property. Please do not think I am insane. I closed my eyes and let the freezing wind hit my face. The lie was absolutely flawless. It perfectly explained the massive power bill, the smoke from the chimney, and the ghost car parked in the snow. It played directly on a grieving father's desperate desire to protect his remaining family. "I do not think you are crazy, Rachel," I said softly, forcing every ounce of paternal warmth I had left into my voice. "Grief makes us do complicated things. Get some sleep. We will surely talk more tomorrow." "Thank you, Dad. I really love you," she whispered before disconnecting. I lowered the phone and exhaled a long breath. For a fleeting second, I actually wanted to believe her. I wanted to turn around, walk back to my truck, and drive straight home. I took one heavy step backward into the deep snow. Suddenly, a blinding, brilliant flash of blue light erupted from the frosted windows of the metal woodshop. It flickered intensely, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the snow-covered yard, accompanied by a faint, very violent crackling sound. My own blood immediately turned to pure ice. That was not a space heater. That was the unmistakable flare of a high-voltage arc welder. Caretakers do not weld heavy structural steel at 2 o'clock in the morning. I did not run. A man my age moving too fast in deep snow is just asking for a broken hip, and right now I needed my body to be as sharp as my mind. I carefully retraced my steps through the dense pine trees, keeping my head down against the biting wind, leaving the humming woodshop and its flashing blue lights behind me. I climbed back into the freezing cabin of my truck, turning the ignition over as quietly as possible. I drove the 40 minutes back to my house in complete silence. I did not even turn on the heater. I needed the freezing air to keep me completely alert. My contractor intuition was screaming at me. A high-voltage arc welder draws an incredible amount of electricity. It requires a dedicated 220-volt circuit and pulls massive amperage. You only use a machine like that when you are fusing heavy structural steel or modifying heavy machinery. A caretaker hired to keep pipes from freezing does not need industrial welding equipment. Rachel had lied to me. She had lied with the effortless perfection of someone who had practiced the lines in a mirror. But why? What was actually happening out there in the dark? When I finally pulled into my driveway, the digital clock on the dashboard read 3:15 in the morning. I unlocked my front door and walked directly past the staircase leading up to my bedroom. Sleep was completely out of the question. I went straight down the hall into my home office and turned on the small brass desk lamp. The room was filled with heavy metal filing cabinets holding 4 decades of my commercial construction business records, along with a separate, heavily secured drawer that contained everything regarding Matthew. I unlocked that specific drawer and pulled out the thick manila folder labeled with my son's estate settlement. I spread the heavy stack of papers across the polished oak surface of my desk. I needed to see the numbers. Numbers do not weep and numbers do not lie. I started sifting through the bank statements, the life insurance payouts, and the final debt clearance forms that Rachel had handed me exactly 8 months ago. My eyes scanned every single printed line, desperately searching for the hidden crack in the foundation. My gaze locked onto a specific bank transfer receipt. It was a withdrawal from my primary retirement account for exactly $300,000. I remembered the day I signed that wire transfer, as if it were yesterday. Rachel had come to my house looking frail, pale, and completely exhausted. She had sat in the exact chair across from my desk, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. She told me that Matthew had secretly taken out massive lines of credit with private material suppliers right before his accident. She claimed he bought hundreds of thousands of dollars in raw steel concrete and heavy lumber for a massive commercial project that never actually got off the ground because he died. According to Rachel, the private lenders were threatening to place a lien on her house and seize everything Matthew had worked so hard to build. I could not bear the thought of my son's legacy being tarnished by unpaid debts. I could not let his young widow lose her home. So, I went to the bank the very next morning and wired her the $300,000 in cash to clear his name. I did not ask for a single receipt. I did not demand to see the supplier invoices. I just paid it, trusting my grieving daughter-in-law completely. But looking at the paperwork now, knowing she had just lied to me about an industrial welding operation out at the supposedly abandoned farm, a sickening realization washed over me. If the car parked in the snow was a lie, and the late-night caretaker was a lie, then the massive material debts were likely a massive lie, too. I needed to know exactly what she did with my $300,000. I sat down in my heavy leather chair and booted up my desktop computer. The monitor cast a pale, cold glow across the dark room. As a retired contractor, I still retained my login credentials for the New York State Commercial Licensing Database. It is a highly secure portal used by commercial developers to verify the bonding, insurance coverage, and active status of any builder operating within the state limits. When a registered contractor passes away, their license is supposed to be immediately frozen and eventually dissolved by the state board during the probate process. I typed my password, navigated to the search directory, and entered Matthew Cole into the query bar. I added his specific federal employer identification number from the estate folder just to be perfectly accurate and avoid any administrative duplicates. I hit the enter key and waited for the page to load. I expected to see a bold red banner reading deceased or legally inactive. Instead, the page refreshed with a bright green status indicator. The word active sat proudly at the top of the digital screen, mocking my grief. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth physically ached. Matthew's commercial contracting license had not been frozen by the state authorities. It had been officially renewed just 4 months ago. I clicked on the Recent Activity tab, and my stomach plummeted into a deep abyss. Under my dead son's name and his highly respected company credentials, someone had recently submitted and officially won 3 massive government contracts for state highway equipment logistics. These were lucrative multiple-million-dollar bids. Someone was actively using a dead man's commercial license to funnel massive state contracts, completely bypassing the standard rigorous background checks, because Matthew's company already had an established golden reputation, built over a decade of incredibly hard, honest work. I scrolled down frantically to the contact information section of the newly awarded contracts, my eyes scanning the fine print. The primary operating phone number listed on the digital forms did not belong to Rachel. I moved my mouse over to the emergency corporate contact field. The name listed there made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. It was Todd. Todd was Matthew's former business partner. He was the man sitting in the passenger seat on the night my son's vehicle supposedly lost control on black ice and flipped into a steep, rocky ravine. Todd was the miraculous sole survivor who walked away from the horrific fatal crash with nothing but a broken collarbone and a few minor scratches on his face. He had stood right at my son's graveside, weeping heavily on my shoulder, swearing to God he would give absolutely anything in the world to trade places with Matthew. And now, exactly 12 long and painful months later, Todd was running a massive ghost operation under my dead son's name, silently reaping the financial benefits of his supposedly tragic death while I sat alone in the dark. The undeniable truth was unraveling right before my very eyes. My son's legacy was being ruthlessly exploited by his very best friend in the entire world. I knew immediately that I had to stop their truly sickening plan. I needed to see her face. I needed to look directly into the eyes of the woman who was weeping over my son's grave while secretly running a fraudulent empire under his name alongside the man who walked away from his fatal crash. I picked up my phone and called Rachel the next morning, pouring every ounce of manufactured exhaustion into my voice. I asked her to come over for a traditional Sunday roast, telling her that the house felt too quiet and that I just needed some familiar company. She agreed immediately, her tone dripping with that same perfectly rehearsed sympathy I had heard on the phone during the snowstorm. I spent the weekend preparing the meal, keeping my hands busy, chopping vegetables and seasoning the meat, so my mind would not tear itself apart with rage. When the doorbell finally rang on Sunday afternoon, I took a deep breath, buried my anger deep in my chest, and opened the door. Rachel stood on my front porch wearing a somber black wool coat and a plain gray scarf, looking exactly like the grieving widow the world expected her to be. She offered me a fragile, brave smile and stepped inside, bringing the cold autumn air with her. But my eyes are trained to notice the smallest structural details, the things that do not belong. As she handed me her coat, I saw it. Resting on her arm was a matte black leather handbag. I may be a retired contractor, but I know luxury when I see it. It was a Hermes Birkin bag, a limited edition piece that required months on a waiting list and cost more than a brand new pickup truck. A woman supposedly drowning in her late husband's construction debt does not casually carry a $30,000 purse to a Sunday dinner. I hung her coat in this hallway closet without saying a word about the bag. We walked into the dining room, and I pulled out her chair, playing the role of the frail, lonely father-in-law to absolute perfection. As she reached across the table to pour herself a glass of water, her gray sweater sleeve rode up just a fraction of an inch. A heavy gleam of polished gold caught the warm light of the dining room chandelier. It was a brand-new Rolex watch, the kind of heavy diamond-encrusted timepiece that executives buy to celebrate massive corporate acquisitions. She quickly pulled her sleeve down, a brief flash of panic crossing her face, but she quickly masked it with another sad smile. I served the roast, keeping the conversation light and nostalgic at first. I asked about her week, and she gave me a practiced, sorrowful rundown of how difficult it was to manage the house alone, how the grief still hit her in unpredictable waves. I nodded sympathetically, eating my food while a cold disgust settled in my stomach. It was time to test the waters. I steered the conversation toward my past, talking about how much the construction industry had changed since I retired. I mentioned that an old buddy of mine was complaining about equipment rental costs. I intentionally threw out a wildly inaccurate number, claiming that leasing a standard Caterpillar excavator was currently running about $1,200 a week. I shook my head, acting bewildered by the fabricated inflation, stating that no honest contractor could possibly turn a profit with overhead costs sitting that incredibly high. Before Matthew died, Rachel did not know the difference between a backhoe and a bulldozer. She had absolutely zero interest in the logistics of heavy machinery or the financial realities of commercial contracting. But now she did not even hesitate. Without missing a single beat, she took a sip of her red wine and shook her head, a confident, slightly arrogant smile touching her lips. She looked me right in the eye and casually corrected my math. She stated that $1,200 a week was a massive underestimation for the current market. She smoothly explained that a Caterpillar 320 series actually commands closer to $3,000 a week, depending heavily on the specific hydraulic attachments and the total operating hours logged on the engine. She even threw in a passing comment about how domestic supply chain issues were driving up the secondary market value of used industrial loaders. As the highly technical words flowed out of her mouth, she suddenly realized exactly who she was talking to. She stopped abruptly, her eyes darting down to her plate. The confident businesswoman vanished, replaced instantly by the stuttering, grieving widow. She quickly mumbled something about having read a random article online recently and tried to desperately change the subject back to the cold weather. I just smiled, nodded, and let her ramble. The trap had successfully snapped shut. The bait was taken. She possessed highly specialized knowledge of the heavy equipment, market knowledge she could only acquire by actively managing a massive industrial operation. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of fake pleasantries. I played the tired old man, perfectly yawning and mentioning that my joints were aching from the cold. Rachel seized the opportunity to make her exit, claiming she had an early morning appointment and needed to get some rest. I walked her to the front door, fetching her heavy black wool coat from the hallway closet. As I held it out for her to slip her arms into the sleeves, she moved a bit too quickly. Her hand caught the edge of the deep side pocket. A small, crumpled piece of white paper dislodged from the fabric and fluttered silently down to the hardwood floor, landing right near the edge of the entry rug. Rachel did not notice it fall. She wrapped her scarf tightly around her neck, gave me one final tragic, trembling hug, and walked out into the chilly night. I stood in the doorway, watching her climb into a sleek silver sedan and drive away down the quiet suburban street. Once her taillights disappeared around the corner, I closed the heavy wooden door and locked the deadbolt. I looked down at the floor. I slowly bent down, my knees popping slightly in the quiet house, and picked up the crumpled piece of paper. I smoothed it out under the bright light of the entryway chandelier. It was an automated toll plaza receipt from the State Highway Authority. I stared at the printed ink, my heart turning to absolute ice. The toll booth location was exactly 2 miles away from the supposedly abandoned upstate farm. I checked the printed timestamp at the very bottom of the small slip. It was dated for the exact same night, at the exact same hour, that I had been standing in the freezing snow, staring at the flashing blue light of the arc welder. The lie was no longer just a suspicion. It was a tangible reality resting right in the palm of my hand. The woman who promised to honor my son's memory was actively destroying it. She was using my own money to do it, and she believed I was too blind to notice. I sat in my quiet hallway for a long time, just staring at that small, crumpled piece of paper. The toll receipt was the ultimate proof of Rachel's deception. The grieving widow routine was a meticulously crafted illusion. The realization that my son's wife was actively plotting against his memory and my finances hit me with the force of a wrecking ball. But anger is a dangerous luxury for a man my age. If I let my emotions take the steering wheel, I would make a fatal mistake. I was dealing with a highly organized operation, and I was completely out of my depth. I needed to move strategically. I needed to disappear without raising a single red flag. The next morning I called Rachel. I kept my voice light, pretending to be the weary, heartbroken old man she thought she had successfully manipulated. I told her that the approaching anniversary of Matthew's death was taking a severe toll on my physical health. I explained that I had impulsively booked a 3-week senior citizen cruise to the Florida Keys. I made sure to emphasize that I would be entirely off the grid, out in the open ocean, with absolutely no cellular reception. Rachel played her part beautifully. She told me it was a wonderful idea, that I deserved to rest and heal, and she promised to keep an eye on my house while I was gone. She sounded genuinely relieved. She thought I was out of the picture. Instead of heading to the airport, I drove my truck in the opposite direction. I went out to a desolate stretch of highway about 10 miles south of Matthew's farm and checked into a dilapidated roadside motel. I paid in cash for a 3-week stay. The room smelled faintly of stale tobacco and cheap industrial bleach. The mattress was thin and the walls were stained, but it was perfect. It was completely untraceable. No one would ever think to look for a wealthy, retired commercial contractor in a place like this. Once I unpacked my meager belongings, I sat on the edge of the creaking bed and pulled out my secure, prepaid cell phone. It was time to assemble my team. I dialed a number I had not used in over 5 years. Jonathan Pierce answered on the second ring. Jonathan was my old corporate attorney, a ruthless, shark-like litigator who had helped me navigate the most cutthroat commercial construction disputes of my career. He was the kind of man who viewed legal battles as blood sport, and I needed his fangs. I quickly briefed him on the fraudulent state highway bids, the massive material debts, and the active contracting license. Jonathan listened silently, his legal mind immediately shifting into high gear. He told me to stay perfectly hidden while he began quietly pulling every financial record and corporate filing associated with Matthew's company. My second call was to Mike Russo. Mike was a former state police detective turned private investigator. We had crossed paths a decade ago when a corrupt subcontractor tried to embezzle funds from one of my high-rise projects. Mike was relentless, operating comfortably in the gray areas of the law, where standard authorities were often too slow to act. I gave him the address of the motel and told him to bring his heavy surveillance equipment. I explained that we were going to war against my own daughter-in-law and her dead husband's former business partner. 2 hours later, Mike and Jonathan were sitting in my dingy motel room. The cramped space felt even smaller, with 2 large, imposing men occupying the cheap plastic chairs. I laid out the toll receipt, the massive electrical bill, and the state contractor printouts on the small circular dining table. I told them about the black SUV, the industrial arc welder, and the unbelievable fact that Todd was listed as the primary corporate contact on the new multi-million-dollar highway contracts. Jonathan adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and frowned at the documents. He explained that if Todd and Rachel were using Matthew's established corporate identity to win state contracts, they were likely funneling illegal money through the legitimate business accounts to clean it. It was a classic corporate hijacking. But to prove it without tipping them off, we needed hard, irrefutable evidence of what exactly was happening inside that heavily secured metal woodshop. Mike unzipped a large black duffel bag and pulled out a sleek, military-grade laptop and a complex directional antenna. He told us that physical entry was too dangerous without knowing their security layout, but digital entry was a completely different game. If they were running a massive illegal operation out of a rural farm, they absolutely needed an internet connection to manage the logistics, communicate with buyers, and process their offshore banking. Mike explained that rural broadband was notoriously insecure. If we could get close enough to the main router, without triggering their motion sensors, he could intercept their network traffic and clone their digital footprint directly onto his laptop. That night, the temperature plummeted to a bone-chilling 12 degrees. Mike and I drove my truck down the pitch-black logging trail, parking in the exact same hidden spot I had used just a few days prior. We hiked through the dense, snow-covered pine trees, our breath pluming in the freezing air. We stopped right at the edge of the tree line, maintaining a safe visual distance from the brightly illuminated metal barn. Smoke was once again pouring from the chimney, and the blue flashes of the arc welder strobed through the frosted windows. Mike crouched low in the deep snow, resting his heavy laptop on a flat tree stump. He attached the directional antenna and pointed it directly at the main house where the primary router was likely located. The cold was punishing, biting through my thick gloves, but my adrenaline kept me intensely focused. I watched Mike type rapidly across his keyboard. Lines of green code cascaded down his black screen. He was running a packet sniffer, a specialized program designed to capture and analyze data floating through the farm's wireless network. After 10 agonizing minutes of shivering in the brutal wind, a small progress bar on his screen flashed blue. Mike looked up at me, a grim expression settling over his rugged face. He had successfully breached the network firewall. He opened a newly decrypted file folder and motioned for me to look closer at the glowing monitor. I leaned down, squinting at the complex digital dashboard. I fully expected to see standard heating control software, or perhaps some basic financial spreadsheets. Instead, the screen displayed a highly sophisticated encrypted logistics tracking interface. There were dozens of active shipment manifests, shipping container schedules, and international routing numbers. Mike pointed to a specific column on the glowing dashboard. The data packets they were actively transmitting had absolutely nothing to do with preventing frozen water pipes. They were viewing real-time GPS tracking codes and altered vehicle identification numbers. The supposedly abandoned upstate farm was acting as a digital command center for a massive, highly organized criminal syndicate. They were actively managing the illegal international export of stolen multi-million-dollar heavy construction machinery. We stayed completely crouched in the freezing snow-covered tree line for another long, agonizing 40 minutes. The biting winter wind whipped harshly through my heavy wool coat, but the fiercely burning anger radiating deeply inside my chest kept the freezing cold entirely at bay. Finally, the heavy metal doors of the woodshop groaned open. The bright halogen lights spilled out onto the snow, illuminating the massive front grille of the black Ford Explorer. The engine roared to life, a deep rumbling sound that echoed across the desolate property. We watched in absolute silence as the vehicle backed out, turned around, and slowly accelerated down the long, winding dirt driveway, heading back toward the main highway. Mike gave it another 10 minutes just to be completely certain the driver was not coming back for a forgotten tool. Then he signaled me with a quick nod. We moved out of the woods, stepping deliberately in the tire tracks left by the SUV to mask our footprints in the fresh snow. As we approached the massive metal structure, Mike pulled a set of professional lockpicks from his heavy tactical jacket. He walked up to the side access door and began examining the deadbolt. I simply reached forward, pushed him gently aside, and slid my hand under the weather stripping along the bottom frame. I felt around until my fingers brushed against a small, hidden magnetic key box. I pulled it out, retrieved the spare key, and unlocked the door with a quiet click. Mike looked at me, clearly surprised. I did not say a word. I did not need to explain that I knew where the spare key was hidden, because I was the one who installed that exact door. 10 years ago, my son and I poured the concrete foundation for this barn with our own hands. We spent an entire summer framing the walls, running the electrical wiring, and installing the heavy corrugated steel roof. Every inch of this building held a memory of a time when my family was whole and happy. Now it was a crime scene. We stepped inside the dark shop. The air was thick with the harsh chemical smell of fresh industrial paint and burning ozone. Mike pulled out a small red-filtered flashlight, clicking it on to sweep the massive interior. The beam of red light revealed a space that had been completely transformed. It was no longer the humble woodworking shop where my son used to craft custom furniture on the weekends. It was a highly organized professional chop shop for heavy construction equipment. Sitting in the center of the concrete floor was a massive Caterpillar front-end loader. It was currently half-painted in a generic blinding yellow, completely obscuring the original factory decals. Surrounding the machine were heavy-duty sanding grinders, chemical paint strippers, and specialized welding torches. I walked slowly toward the back corner of the building, my boots stepping over tangled power cords and discarded metal shavings. Against the far wall, I found a heavy workbench covered in scattered metal plates. I picked one up and examined it closely under the dim red light. It was a vehicle identification number plate. Beside it sat a high-precision metal stamping press and a stack of completely blank registration tags. They were actively grinding off the original serial numbers from stolen machinery and stamping brand-new counterfeit identities onto the equipment before shipping it out. The sheer scale of the operation was staggering. Millions of dollars of stolen commercial property were moving through the very building I had constructed with my boy. Mike tapped my shoulder, bringing my focus back to the immediate mission. He handed me 2 tiny wireless micro-cameras from his duffel bag. We needed to place them in strategic locations where they could capture clear facial identities and audio without ever being detected. I knew the structural layout better than anyone. I climbed up the steel access ladder to the overhead ventilation ducts, moving silently along the reinforced crossbeams. I attached the first camera directly above the primary bay doors, angling the wide lens to cover the entire main floor where the painting and metal stamping took place. I climbed down and moved toward the enclosed administrative office situated in the back corner of the barn. I installed the second camera high up inside a faux smoke detector, ensuring it had a perfect, unobstructed view of the desk and the filing cabinets. The camera feeds synced perfectly to Mike's encrypted laptop back in his vehicle. We had them completely surrounded by digital eyes. With the cameras securely in place, I took a moment to look around the small administrative office. This was where Matthew used to sketch his blueprints and manage his modest business expenses. Now the desk was cluttered with thick manila folders, international shipping manifests, and large stacks of customs declaration forms. I pulled a small penlight from my pocket and began carefully flipping through the paperwork, searching for anything that would reveal their ultimate endgame. The documents were shocking. They were arranging massive cargo shipments out of the port of Newark, sending the stolen and rebranded machinery to buyers in South America and Eastern Europe. But it was the folder sitting at the very bottom of the stack that made my breath catch sharply in my throat. It was a thick blue legal binder labeled with the name of a prominent offshore holding company. I opened the heavy cover and began reading the complex legal jargon. They were commercial lease agreements for massive million-dollar industrial warehouses located in the Cayman Islands and Panama. The lease terms were for 10 years, fully paid in advance, locking in secure storage facilities for their international smuggling ring. I flipped to the final page of the contract to see who was listed as the primary leaseholder. My eyes scanned past the dense paragraphs of liability clauses and financial obligations. I stared at the designated signature line at the very bottom of the crisp white page. The blood instantly drained from my face, leaving me feeling completely numb. I had expected to see Rachel's name. I had expected to see the name of whatever criminal associate she was secretly working with to move the stolen machinery across international borders. Instead, sitting there in bold, dark blue ink was a signature I knew better than my own reflection. It was my name, Harrison Cole. The signature was an absolute masterpiece of forgery. The loops, the specific slant of the letters, the heavy pressure on the final stroke, it was entirely indistinguishable from my actual handwriting. I quickly flipped through the rest of the blue binder. Every single page, every single offshore lease agreement, every single international customs declaration form bore my perfectly forged signature. The magnitude of their horrific plan finally locked into place. They were not just running a highly lucrative criminal syndicate out of my dead son's farm. They were actively framing me for the entire operation. If the federal authorities ever raided this facility, the paper trail would lead directly to a retired contractor in his 70s. They were going to let me burn, destroying my life while they walked away completely rich. The drive back to the dreary roadside motel was an exercise in pure psychological endurance. Mike kept the heavy truck perfectly steady on the treacherous ice-covered roads, but my own hands were trembling so violently I had to jam them deep into my coat pockets. The cold was no longer just the winter weather outside the windshield. It was a freezing, suffocating weight pressing down directly onto my chest. I had spent my entire adult life building a spotless reputation in commercial construction. My name was synonymous with integrity, hard work, and unbreakable trust. Now that very same name was neatly forged at the bottom of highly illegal international shipping manifests and offshore warehouse leases. Rachel and her silent partner had meticulously woven a legal noose out of my grief and slipped it right over my head. When we finally pushed open the flimsy door to the motel room, Jonathan was sitting exactly where we left him, surrounded by towering stacks of digital printouts. He looked up, sensing the drastic shift in the atmosphere immediately. I walked over to the small circular table and dropped the heavy blue binder right in front of him. I told him to look at the signature line on the final page of every single lease agreement. Jonathan flipped open the binder, adjusting his glasses. I watched the color drain from the face of a man who routinely battled corporate sharks for a living. He looked up at me, his voice stripped of all its usual aggressive confidence. He stated that this was no longer a simple case of corporate embezzlement. They were constructing a flawless, fully documented paper trail designed to frame me as the undisputed kingpin of an international smuggling syndicate. If federal agents raided that farm tonight, I would spend the rest of my natural life rotting in a maximum security prison. Mike did not waste a single second. He immediately unzipped his black duffel bag and set up his encrypted tactical laptop right next to Jonathan's chaotic pile of legal documents. He connected the wireless receiver and ran a complex decryption sequence to tap directly into the micro cameras we had just planted inside the barn. The dark screen flickered for a brief moment before splitting into two crystal-clear, high-definition video feeds. The first angle showed a wide, sweeping view of the main concrete floor, capturing the massive, half-painted Caterpillar front-end loader and the various metal stamping tools scattered across the heavy workbench. The second angle was a tight, directly overhead shot of the administrative desk where the forged documents were stored. The audio feed hissed softly through the small laptop speakers, broadcasting the ambient hum of the industrial space heaters and the faint rhythmic dripping of melting snow from the corrugated steel roof. We sat in the cramped, stale motel room, bathed entirely in the pale blue light of the computer monitor. The digital clock in the corner of the screen ticked past 4 in the morning. Every passing minute felt like a physical weight pressing down on my exhausted shoulders. I stared at the empty, brightly lit barn, my mind racing through 1,000 different fragmented memories. I thought about Rachel standing in my home just a few hours ago, clutching her $30,000 handbag, perfectly playing the role of the shattered, helpless widow. I thought about the $300,000 I had handed her in good faith, money she clearly used to seed this massive criminal enterprise. But most of all, I kept wondering about the phantom caretaker. Who was the man driving the black SUV who possessed the highly specialized mechanical skills required to strip and rebrand heavy industrial equipment? We sat in suffocating silence, our eyes glued to the glowing screen, waiting for the trap to spring. Suddenly, the low, distant rumble of a heavy engine echoed through the laptop speakers. Mike immediately leaned forward, his fingers hovering over the keyboard, hitting a quick command to enhance the audio gain. The distinct crunch of heavy tires rolling over packed snow grew steadily louder. On the first camera feed, the massive aluminum bay doors began to rattle slightly. A blinding sweep of bright white headlights pierced through the small frosted windows of the barn, throwing long, jagged shadows across the concrete floor. The vehicle had returned. The heavy engine idled outside for a long moment, filling the silent motel room with a low, menacing vibration. Then the side access door swung open. A towering figure stepped into the bright, harsh glare of the halogen lights. He was wearing a thick, black, insulated winter parka with a heavy hood pulled up tight over his head, obscuring his face completely from the high angle of the camera. He turned back to push the heavy door shut, locking the deadbolt with a loud metallic clack. He stood near the entrance, stomping the thick snow off his heavy work boots. The man moved with a familiar, confident swagger. He did not walk like a hired hand or a temporary caretaker checking on frozen pipes. He moved like a man who owned the building. He walked directly across the main floor, passing the massive Caterpillar loader without so much as a second glance, and headed straight toward the enclosed administrative office in the back corner. He entered the small office, stepping directly into the tight overhead frame of our second camera. He paused right in front of the desk, reaching up with gloved hands to pull back the heavy black hood of his parka. When he finally looked up, catching the harsh overhead light, the breath completely vanished from my lungs. The entire room started spinning. My hands gripped the edge of the cheap plastic table so hard, my knuckles turned a bruised, sickening white. It was Todd. It was Matthew's former business partner. The man who was sitting right next to my son when their truck supposedly hit a patch of black ice. The man who had survived the horrific crash with practically zero injuries. I felt violently ill. The memories crashed into my mind with ruthless force. I remembered Todd standing at the cemetery, in the freezing rain, dressed in a sharp black suit. I remembered him throwing his arms around my neck, sobbing uncontrollably onto my shoulder, loudly begging God for forgiveness, and dramatically swearing that he would dedicate the rest of his life to looking out for Rachel. It had all been an incredibly sick, calculated performance. He had not been mourning the tragic loss of a brother. He had been celebrating the successful removal of an obstacle. Todd casually tossed his wet gloves onto the desk and reached into his heavy coat. He pulled out a sleek, reinforced titanium briefcase and placed it directly under our hidden camera lens. He snapped the metallic latches open. The briefcase was packed completely to the brim with thick, banded stacks of crisp $100 bills. Todd leaned over the desk, pulling out the heavy bundles of freshly laundered cash, and began rapidly counting them with a cold, terrifying precision. The ultimate truth was undeniable. Todd was the undisputed mastermind of the massive chop shop. Mike shifted his weight in the cheap plastic chair, his eyes darting back and forth between the two live video feeds illuminating the dim motel room. The soft, rhythmic sound of Todd thumbing through the thick stacks of $100 bills echoed through the laptop speakers, sounding like a grotesque heartbeat. Jonathan sat perfectly rigid next to me, his brilliant legal mind undoubtedly cataloging every single felony being committed on the glowing screen. For several agonizing minutes, the only movement inside the massive metal barn was Todd methodically sorting the illicit cash into neat, calculated piles across the administrative desk. Then the heavy motion sensor lights near the primary bay doors flickered to life. A second set of headlights swept across the frosted windows, casting a brilliant white beam against the corrugated steel walls. The low hum of a smaller engine approached the building. I recognized the smooth, quiet purr immediately. It was the same sleek silver sedan that had pulled out of my driveway just a few hours ago. The side access door swung open, allowing a brutal gust of winter wind to scatter a few loose shipping manifests across the concrete floor. Rachel stepped into the brightly lit shop. She was still wearing the same somber black wool coat and plain gray scarf she had worn to my house for our traditional Sunday roast. But as she closed the heavy metal door behind her, securing the deadbolt with a swift, practiced motion, a sickening transformation took place. She unwound the scarf from her neck and shrugged off the heavy coat, tossing them carelessly onto a stack of wooden shipping pallets. Beneath the morning attire, she was wearing a sharp tailored crimson blouse and dark designer slacks. The frail, trembling posture she had maintained at my dining room table was completely gone. Her shoulders were pulled back, her chin was held high, and she walked with an undeniable predatory confidence. The grieving widow illusion evaporated into the freezing air, leaving behind a cold, calculating woman entirely at home inside a massive criminal chop shop. She did not look distressed, she did not look frightened, and she certainly did not look like a woman drowning in her late husband's supposed financial ruins. She looked absolutely victorious. I watched the screen in absolute paralyzing horror as she moved fluidly past the half-painted Caterpillar front-end loader, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the cold concrete floor. Todd looked up from his organized stacks of laundered cash, a wide, arrogant grin spreading across his face as Rachel approached the administrative desk. He did not offer her a polite nod or a respectful greeting. Instead, he stepped out from behind the cluttered desk, meeting her right near the massive metal tracks of the stolen bulldozer. Rachel did not hesitate. She closed the distance between them and threw her arms tightly around his neck. Todd wrapped his hands around her waist, lifting her slightly off the concrete floor as they engaged in a deep, passionate embrace. They kissed with a fierce, undeniable familiarity that made my stomach aggressively churn. This was not a new romance born out of shared grief. This was an established, deeply rooted intimacy that had clearly been burning long before my son was ever put into the frozen ground. Jonathan let out a low, disgusted breath beside me while Mike simply adjusted the audio dials, ensuring we captured every single word they were about to speak. They pulled apart, but Rachel kept her hands resting comfortably on Todd's broad chest. She tilted her head back and let out a bright, ringing laugh that echoed loudly through the hidden microphone. It was a joyful, carefree sound that I had not heard since before my son was lowered into the dark earth. "How was the miserable family dinner?" Todd asked, his voice dripping with intense condescension as he leaned back casually against the yellow steel frame of the bulldozer. Rachel rolled her eyes dramatically, waving her hand in the air as if dismissing a minor frustrating annoyance. "It was absolute torture," she replied, her tone sharp and completely devoid of the trembling sorrow she had performed exclusively for me. The old man cooked a dry roast and spent the entire evening acting like he belongs in a supervised assisted living facility. He complained about his joints constantly. He complained about the freezing weather. And he actually tried to tell me that leasing a standard excavator costs $1,200 a week. Can you even believe that I almost laughed right in his pathetic face? Todd chuckled a deep, raspy sound that made my hands clench into extremely tight, painful fists. "You didn't actually correct him, did you?" he asked, crossing his arms over his broad chest. Rachel smirked playfully, leaning much closer to him. "Of course I did. I couldn't help myself. I threw the real secondary market rates right back at him. He looked completely bewildered. He has absolutely no idea what is actually happening out here. He is totally blind to the real world." I felt a cold bead of sweat roll slowly down the back of my neck. They were completely convinced of their own absolute invincibility. They genuinely thought I was nothing more than a broken, incredibly gullible old man who was actively funding their shockingly luxurious lifestyle without asking any real questions. It was the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal executed perfectly under the guise of shared family mourning. Todd finally pushed his weight off the bright yellow heavy machinery and walked back around the cluttered administrative desk, His greedy eyes locked instantly onto the massive titanium briefcase filled completely with illicit currency. He reached into the nearest stack of freshly laundered $100 bills and pulled out a remarkably thick, heavy bundle. He tossed it casually across the polished wooden surface directly toward Rachel. She caught it gracefully in one hand, her eyes gleaming with undisguised, profound greed as she flipped rapidly through the crisp paper money. Todd leaned his weight heavily onto the wooden desk, looking directly up toward the hidden ceiling camera without actually realizing it was securely planted there. A cruel, viciously mocking smile twisted his features into something truly monstrous and unforgivable. Rachel immediately threw her head back and laughed aloud once again, producing a remarkably harsh, fiercely biting sound that completely and irrevocably shattered whatever tiny lingering fragment of paternal hope I had somehow left remaining deep inside my battered chest. She tucked the massive bundle of stolen cash directly into her expensive leather handbag, shaking her head in deep amusement. "He genuinely believes Matthew was an absolute failure who ruined the business," she stated smoothly. "He thinks he saved me. We will bleed his remaining accounts completely dry before the state boards finally catch up to the fraudulent licensing." Todd nodded, completely confident and undeniably ruthless. He slowly turned his head and stared blankly toward the ceiling, looking straight into our hidden camera lens, while actively making his final, absolutely crushing and undeniably heartless closing statement. Todd said, his voice echoing loudly, "The old fool's $300,000 bought us the first 3 stolen loaders. He literally funded his own son's replacement." The audio feed hissed in the motel room, but the words hung in the air like poison. "The old fool's $300,000 bought us the first 3 stolen loaders. He literally funded his own son's replacement." I sat completely frozen in the cheap plastic chair. My aging lungs simply refused to pull in enough oxygen. The sheer magnitude of the betrayal was so profoundly unnatural that my mind actively struggled to process the raw cruelty of it. Rachel was not just an opportunistic widow who had fallen into bed with her dead husband's friend. She was a deeply malicious architect of my complete destruction. I had handed over my savings to protect my son's honor, and they used my grieving love to build a criminal empire. Jonathan Pierce slowly reached over and gently closed the lid of Mike's laptop, immediately cutting off the sickening video feed. He looked at me with pure, unadulterated resolve. He stated that we needed to stop looking at the emotional wreckage and start dismantling their foundation. Jonathan pulled his computer from his briefcase and opened it on the table. He firmly told me that arrogant criminals always make mistakes when they get overly confident with large sums of stolen cash. If Rachel and Todd were truly arrogant enough to openly admit how they allocated my specific funds, Jonathan could meticulously follow that financial bloodline and see exactly where every single dollar went. For the next 3 long hours, Jonathan executed a brilliant masterclass in forensic corporate accounting. He utilized the router footprint Mike had intercepted to access the offshore banking portals Todd was using. He traced the initial wire transfer I sent to Rachel 8 months ago. We watched the digital ledger slowly unfold right before our eyes. Rachel immediately moved my $300,000 into an account registered under a shell company. From there, the stolen money heavily fragmented. Jonathan successfully tracked the largest chunks, verifying that a significant portion was indeed sent to international heavy equipment brokers, completely validating Todd's boast about purchasing the stolen front-end loaders. But Jonathan's eyes narrowed sharply as he highlighted a strange, irregular anomaly in the financial ledger. $75,000 from my initial transfer had been diverted away from the equipment purchases. It had been wired into a separate domestic holding account. Jonathan ran a cross-reference on the receiving account and pulled up a registration form. The money had been deposited into a consulting firm owned by a man named Arthur Vance. Jonathan frowned, tapping his pen aggressively against the plastic table. He dug deeper into the public records, pulling up Arthur Vance's official licensing credentials. When the full profile loaded onto the bright screen, Mike Russo suddenly leaned forward, releasing a sharp, heavy breath. He pointed directly at the digital photograph of a man with a thick gray mustache. Mike knew him. Arthur Vance was a corrupt, disgraced former highway patrolman who currently operated as an independent crash investigator. He specialized in writing manipulated accident reconstruction reports for shady insurance claims and corporate liability defenses. My blood ran completely cold. I remembered seeing Arthur Vance's name at the bottom of the police report regarding Matthew's accident. He was the independent specialist who officially ruled that my son had simply lost control of his truck on a dangerous patch of black ice. Jonathan quickly highlighted the transaction dates. The timeline was absolutely damning. Arthur Vance had received an initial payment of $25,000 just 3 days after Matthew's vehicle plunged into the rocky ravine. The $75,000, the money siphoned from my wire transfer, was a delayed secondary payout. It was a massive blackmail fee. They were using my own money to keep the man who investigated my son's death completely quiet. I stood up from the cheap plastic chair, my knees popping loudly in the quiet room. The truth was crystallizing in my mind, forming a picture so dark that it threatened to break my sanity. If Rachel and Todd had to pay a crash investigator over $100,000 in money, then Matthew's fatal crash was never an accident. Mike slammed his laptop shut and grabbed his tactical jacket. He looked at me with cold, dangerous eyes. He stated that we were not going to wait for the federal authorities to build a case against a cop. We were going to pay Arthur Vance a personal visit right now. We left Jonathan at the motel to continue archiving the digital evidence. Mike and I climbed into my truck and drove silently through the freezing night. Mike utilized his contacts to pinpoint Arthur Vance's location. The investigator operated out of a park on the outskirts of the city. We pulled into the empty parking lot just before dawn. Vance's rusted sedan was the only vehicle parked outside an office building. We approached the heavy glass door. Mike did not bother knocking. He produced a tool and bypassed the lock in a matter of seconds. We stepped into the office. Arthur Vance was sitting behind a cheap metal desk, nursing a glass of whiskey, staring at a glowing monitor. He looked up, his eyes widening in terror, as Mike locked the door behind us and calmly pulled the heavy blinds shut. Mike walked right across the room and slammed a stack of ledgers onto Vance's desk. The papers clearly detailed the offshore wire transfers from Todd and Rachel's shell company into his private accounts. Mike did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, lethal authority. He told Vance that we had hacked the entire offshore syndicate, that the federal government would be seizing all of his assets by the end of the week, and that he was currently looking at 20 years in a federal penitentiary for accessory to corporate fraud and money laundering. Arthur Vance began to hyperventilate. His heavy chest heaved and sweat poured down his face. He stammered frantically, claiming that he was just a hired consultant, that he only wrote the reports he was paid to write, and that he had absolutely no idea how deep the criminal syndicate truly went. He swore he was just taking a standard payoff to look the other way on a simple insurance claim. I slowly stepped out from the shadows near the doorway and walked up to his desk. I leaned down, placing both of my hands flat on the cold metal surface, bringing my face inches from his terrified features. I told him my name. I told him I was Matthew Cole's father. I demanded to know exactly what he found when he pulled my son's truck out of that frozen ravine. Vance looked deeply into my eyes and saw zero mercy. He began to weep, a pathetic sound that echoed loudly in the small office. He confessed that when he carefully examined the undercarriage of the crushed vehicle, the primary brake lines had not ruptured from the violent impact of the crash. They had been intentionally severed with wire cutters before the truck ever left the driveway. He looked at me trembling violently and delivered the final truth. He sobbed that it was not an accident at all. Todd and Rachel had brutally murdered Matthew to take over the entire company. The absolutely sickening words hung heavily in the stale air of the small office like a massive physical weight. Murder. My son had not died in a tragic winter accident on a treacherous patch of black ice. He had been brutally executed by the woman he loved and the man he trusted with his livelihood. For a brief, terrifying second, the edges of my vision darkened. The floor beneath my heavy boots felt as though it were collapsing into an endless, terrifying void. A powerful wave of intense, sickening nausea rolled fiercely through my stomach, threatening to bring me completely to my knees. The urge to scream out my agony, to wrap my hands tightly around Arthur Vance's throat and squeeze until he stopped breathing, was completely overpowering. But I did not move a single solitary inch. I did not shed a single visible tear. 40 years in commercial construction had fundamentally wired my brain to respond to catastrophic structural failures with absolute discipline. When a massive steel beam snaps or a concrete foundation severely cracks, you do not stand around weeping in the rubble. You brace the surrounding structure, calculate the exact extent of the damage, and systematically dismantle the problem before it completely buries you. I forced my spine straight and pulled a deep, freezing breath into my aging lungs. I looked at the weeping investigator cowering behind his cheap metal desk and felt nothing but pure, unadulterated contempt. I turned my back on him and walked out into the freezing parking lot, leaving Mike to extract every piece of documented evidence Vance possessed. The drive back to the motel was executed in complete and utter silence. The winter sunrise slowly painted the horizon in shades of bruised purple and dull gray. I gripped the leather steering wheel until my forearms physically ached, channeling every ounce of my agonizing grief into a hardened, highly focused rage. When we pushed open the flimsy door to our rented room, Jonathan was still sitting at the small circular table, his eyes bloodshot from a completely sleepless night of intense forensic accounting. Mike quickly briefed him on Vance's horrific confession. Jonathan stopped typing, his hands resting motionless on his laptop keyboard. The ruthless corporate lawyer looked at me with a profound, quiet respect, silently acknowledging the devastating burden I was carrying. He did not offer any useless apologies or hollow words of manufactured comfort. Instead, he simply tapped his computer screen and informed us that the offshore digital router was still highly active. Todd and Rachel had remained inside the secure metal barn for the entire duration of the night. I walked over to the desk and pulled up a cheap plastic chair. I leaned heavily forward, locking my eyes onto the high-definition video feeds streaming live from the remote upstate farm. The interior of the massive woodshop was bathed in the harsh glare of industrial halogen lighting. The stolen Caterpillar loader sat silently in the center of the concrete floor. On the secondary camera angle, Todd and Rachel were seated close together behind Matthew's old wooden desk, poring over a sprawling mess of international logistics paperwork. The audio receiver hissed quietly, picking up the clear, rhythmic tapping of Todd's pen against the hard desk surface. They were wide awake, fueled by dangerous adrenaline and the intoxicating promise of massive illegal wealth. I forced myself to watch the screen, suppressing the violent urge to smash the monitor to pieces. I needed to know exactly how they planned to finalize their operation. I needed every single detail of their exit strategy. I sat perfectly still and listened closely as the two people who murdered my only child casually plotted their final move. Todd leaned back in the heavy leather office chair, running his hands through his dark hair. He sounded exhausted but deeply satisfied. He tapped a thick stack of printed customs declaration forms and stated that the overseas transport ship was officially scheduled to leave the main commercial port in exactly 4 days. Rachel sat perfectly still, casually filing her nails while listening to the highly illegal logistics. Todd smoothly outlined the final transaction parameters for his eager partner. He confirmed that the overseas buyer was representing a massive international cartel based deep within South America. The foreign syndicate was paying them a flat rate of exactly $2 million in completely untraceable offshore cryptocurrency for the current batch of rebranded construction machinery. Rachel finally looked up from her manicured hands, her eyes gleaming with absolute unrestrained greed. She smiled widely and smoothly calculated their individual profit margins out loud, openly discussing how quickly they could transfer the digital funds into their private holding accounts in the Cayman Islands. They spoke about the millions of dollars with the casual, relaxed demeanor of ordinary people discussing a weekly grocery list. They were actively counting their massive fortune while standing directly over the grave of my murdered son. Todd reassured her that the secondary market buyers had already reviewed the forged vehicle identification numbers and were entirely satisfied with the paperwork. He boldly claimed that the heavy equipment would smoothly pass through standard port security without triggering a single automated alarm. The entire shipping container operation was a beautifully executed masterpiece of corporate fraud. As I listened closely to their arrogant voices echoing through the tiny laptop speakers, I noticed a slight, deeply hidden tremor of anxiety creep into Rachel's normally perfectly composed tone. Rachel stopped filing her nails and leaned her elbows heavily onto the wooden desk. She stared intensely at the towering stacks of counterfeit shipping manifests and freshly printed corporate leases. She quietly asked Todd what would realistically happen if their digital firewall failed. She wanted to know the exact protocol if a highly motivated federal investigator suddenly noticed the massive irregularities in their offshore banking transfers. Her voice grew tight as she asked what would occur if a tactical team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation suddenly kicked down the massive aluminum bay doors of the farm before the international cargo ship could clear the harbor. She was terrified of spending her life in a federal penitentiary. Todd did not show a single ounce of fear or hesitation. He reached across the cluttered desk and picked up the thick blue legal binder containing the offshore warehouse lease agreements. He dropped the heavy binder in front of Rachel and tapped his finger aggressively against the final page. He laughed a dark, utterly soulless sound that chilled me to the very bone. Todd smoothly reminded her that the rural farm property was permanently locked in Matthew's estate, making it untouchable while the complex probate process dragged on. Then he confidently pointed directly at the perfectly forged signature sitting boldly at the bottom of the legal paperwork. He looked at Rachel, his voice completely devoid of any human empathy, and stated his final devastating guarantee. He told her clearly that the farm was in Matthew's name, but the equipment leases were entirely in Harrison's name. He smiled wickedly and proudly declared that if the FBI kicks down the door, the 70-year-old takes the fall. We take the cash and disappear. The sheer weight of Todd's chilling declaration hung suspended in the stale air of the motel room, thick and suffocating. They had literally factored my freedom into their profit margins. My lungs burned as I fought the overwhelming physical urge to violently smash my fists through the glowing computer monitor. I wanted to drive my truck straight through those heavy aluminum bay doors, wrap my calloused hands around their throats, and demand to know exactly how my boy died. But that kind of blind explosive rage is exactly what gets a man killed. 40 years in the high-stakes commercial construction industry had fundamentally rewired my entire nervous system. When a massive steel support column buckles and an entire foundation threatens to collapse, you do not waste precious seconds weeping into the dust. You brutally suppress the panic, you stabilize the surrounding structure, and you surgically dismantle the threat before it buries you alive. I forced my spine against the rigid plastic of the motel chair, locking my jaw until my teeth physically ached. I absolutely refused to break down. I would not grant them the satisfaction of my destruction. I pulled a long, jagged breath of cheap motel air into my lungs and focused every single ounce of my remaining energy entirely on the glowing screen. Mike and Jonathan watched me in complete reverent silence, instinctively understanding that the grieving father had just vanished completely, replaced by a man preparing for absolute war. On the primary camera feed, Todd shifted his weight against the bright yellow frame of the stolen Caterpillar loader, his eyes sweeping across the massive chop shop floor with deep, terrifying satisfaction. He turned his attention back to Rachel, smoothly transitioning from the cold reality of their frame up to the incredibly lucrative logistics of their immediate exit strategy. He confirmed that the overseas holding company had successfully verified the routing numbers for the $2 million crypto transfer. The international cartel operating deep out of South America was entirely pleased with the customized vehicle identification numbers. Todd explained that the shipping containers were fully secured and would be loaded onto the massive commercial freighter at the port of Newark in exactly 96 hours. Rachel leaned her elbows onto the wooden desk, vibrating with a greedy, toxic adrenaline. She quickly calculated their exact offshore profit margins out loud, gleefully discussing how they would permanently disappear to a private gated compound in Costa Rica the very moment the digital funds cleared. They spoke about their impending fortune with the casual, relaxed demeanor of ordinary tourists planning a simple weekend getaway. They were celebrating their magnificent victory while standing directly on top of the blood-soaked empire they had violently ripped from my dead son. But as the conversation shifted away from the international logistics, a sudden sharp edge of raw anxiety crept into Rachel's perfectly manicured voice. She stood up from the heavy leather office chair and began pacing nervously across the tight frame of the hidden ceiling camera. Her expensive designer heels clicked rapidly against the cold concrete floor. She crossed her arms tightly over her crimson blouse, her brow furrowing with genuine concern. She told Todd that she was deeply worried about the immediate timeline. The foreign cartel payout was still 4 agonizing days away, and they urgently needed liquid capital to physically pay off the corrupt port officials and harbor inspectors who were facilitating the container loading process. Rachel bit her lower lip, glancing nervously toward the dark windows of the barn. She stated that they had completely drained the initial $300,000 I had given her. The only available capital left to cover the massive bribes was my protected union pension fund. But Rachel was terrified. She argued that pulling hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from my personal retirement accounts would trigger massive banking alerts. She reminded Todd that I was a meticulous, highly disciplined contractor who checked his financial statements religiously. She panicked frantically, whispering that if I noticed the missing pension funds before the cargo ship officially left the harbor, I would immediately call the state authorities, effectively burning their entire operation to the ground before they could escape to the tropics. Todd simply laughed. It was a dark, incredibly vicious sound that echoed loudly through the tiny laptop speakers, completely devoid of any recognizable human empathy. He pushed himself off the heavy construction equipment and walked slowly back to the administrative desk. He reached into his thick winter parka and pulled out a heavily sealed manila medical envelope. He tossed it casually onto the desk right in front of Rachel's trembling hands. He told her to stop panicking like an amateur. He stated that he had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously preparing a bulletproof, completely devastating backup plan for this exact scenario. Todd smoothly explained that he had utilized a significant portion of their stolen cash to heavily bribe a deeply corrupt, highly credentialed private neurologist operating out of a prominent state medical facility. He instructed Rachel to open the thick envelope and read the official diagnosis. Rachel carefully broke the seal and pulled out the crisp white medical documents. As her eyes scanned the clinical text, her panicked expression rapidly morphed into a wide, purely evil smile. The paperwork was a perfectly forged, fully authenticated medical decree legally stating that Harrison Cole was suffering from severe, rapidly advancing, and violently aggressive Alzheimer's disease. The corrupt physician had officially documented a completely fabricated history of dangerous cognitive decline, severe memory loss, and threatening paranoid delusions. The medical evaluation was an absolute masterpiece of psychological destruction, legally painting me as a complete danger to myself and an immediate threat to the general public. Rachel traced her finger gently over the very prominent blue ink of the expertly forged medical signature, letting out a soft, almost breathless gasp of pure, unadulterated admiration. She looked up at Todd, her eyes practically shining with a dark, romantic adoration for the ruthless monster standing right in front of her. She asked him exactly how they were going to seamlessly execute the final phase of this brilliant, merciless strategy against my life. Todd leaned his weight heavily onto the polished wood of the desk, his face perfectly illuminated by the harsh overhead halogen lights. He looked directly upward, completely unaware that his cold, extremely soulless eyes were piercing straight into the hidden lens of our covert microcamera. He smiled widely, proudly, showcasing a row of white teeth, and delivered the ultimate, totally crushing death blow to my entire peaceful existence. His cruel voice was smooth, dripping with an absolute, sickening confidence that made the blood freeze completely solid inside my rapidly beating heart. Todd finally laughed a low, sinister, rumbling chuckle that vibrated aggressively through the tiny speakers of the tactical laptop. He pointed a single incredibly steady index finger directly at the fraudulent medical documents resting on the desk. "We do not have to worry about the old man noticing the missing pension funds," Todd declared with absolute chilling, terrifying certainty. "We freeze his accounts, throw him in a state-operated psych ward, and become his legal conservators by Friday." The absolute magnitude of that deeply depraved statement hung suspended in the stale, suffocating air of the tiny motel room. They were not merely satisfied with stealing my entire life savings or dismantling my unblemished professional reputation. They were actively conspiring to strip away my basic human autonomy legally, declaring me insane and locking me away in a heavily medicated nightmare for the rest of my natural existence. The breathtaking cruelty of their meticulous plan washed over me in freezing, heavy waves. I stared at the bright screen of the tactical laptop, watching Rachel smile back at Todd with pure, unadulterated adoration. She did not display a single trace of hesitation or moral conflict. The woman I had graciously welcomed into my home, the grieving widow I had held, while she openly wept over my son's grave, was enthusiastically celebrating the impending theft of my freedom. Beside me, Jonathan Pierce let out a sharp, ragged breath, his legal mind clearly struggling to process the profound depth of their malice. Mike Russo remained perfectly still, his hardened features carved out of solid stone, his eyes locked on the live video feed. I gripped the fragile plastic edges of the cheap folding table until my knuckles burned with sharp agony. Every single fiber of my aging body vibrated with a raw, explosive fury that I had never experienced before in my entire life. I wanted to violently tear the computer monitor directly off the desk. I wanted to smash through the heavy aluminum bay doors of my own workshop and wrap my calloused hands around their throats. But the deeply ingrained discipline of 40 years in the commercial construction industry clamped down heavily on my fracturing psyche. When you are tasked with safely demolishing a collapsing concrete structure, you do not recklessly swing a sledgehammer into the primary load-bearing walls. You strategically analyze the structural weaknesses, you systematically isolate the core foundation, and you meticulously orchestrate the complete collapse exactly on your own terms. I violently suppressed the suffocating bile rising in my throat and forced my burning eyes to remain completely focused on the high-definition digital feed. I absolutely refused to look away from the monsters who had brutally executed my only child. On the crystal-clear digital broadcast, the atmosphere inside the brightly lit administrative office suddenly shifted. The cold, highly methodical discussion regarding the lucrative international shipping logistics and my impending psychiatric incarceration dissolved into something far more intimately sinister. Todd slowly pushed his heavy weight away from the polished wooden surface of Matthew's old desk. He took a deliberate, measured step toward Rachel, his towering frame completely dominating the tight camera angle. The harsh, incredibly bright glare of the industrial halogen lights cast long, jagged shadows across the cold concrete floor. Todd reached a heavy, gloved hand deep into the dark interior pocket of his thick winter parka. He withdrew his hand slowly, keeping his fingers tightly curled shut around a small, concealed object. Rachel tilted her head, her perfectly manicured features lighting up with genuine, highly enthusiastic curiosity. She eagerly stepped closer to him, her expensive leather boots clicking sharply against the hard floor. She playfully asked him if he had finally managed to retrieve the special collateral they had previously discussed. Todd offered her a wide, deeply arrogant grin that fundamentally twisted his face into a terrifying mask of pure evil. He slowly opened his closed fist, extending his broad palm directly under the incredibly bright, unflinching beam of the overhead light. Resting innocuously in the very center of his calloused palm was a stunning, impeccably preserved piece of vintage jewelry. The brilliant, flawlessly cut gemstone instantly caught the harsh artificial light, casting a vibrant, mesmerizing array of deep shimmering green reflections across the cluttered administrative desk. It was an intricately designed, custom-crafted ring, completely surrounded by a delicate, highly detailed halo of flawless, brilliant cut diamonds. I stopped breathing. The air forcefully vacated my burning lungs. The entire motel room started to spin violently around my seated body. My heart slammed aggressively against my ribs, beating with a frantic, completely erratic rhythm that threatened to break my chest wide open. I recognized that magnificent, incredibly unique piece of jewelry instantly. It was the exact same vintage emerald ring that I had personally placed onto my late wife's finger over 45 years ago. I had spent 6 grueling months working grueling double shifts on a massive commercial roofing project just to afford that highly specific, deeply treasured gemstone. When my beautiful wife tragically passed away, I had lovingly passed that precious family heirloom down to my only son, explicitly instructing Matthew to give it to the woman he truly wanted to spend the rest of his natural life with. When Matthew joyfully placed that emerald ring on Rachel's finger, I had foolishly believed our family legacy was permanently secured. Following the horrific, devastating crash, I had desperately asked Rachel if the police investigators had managed to recover the sentimental piece of jewelry from the deeply frozen wreckage. She had looked me directly in the eyes, crying hysterical, broken tears, and solemnly sworn that the precious ring had been completely lost in the violent, incredibly fiery destruction of the shattered truck. That absolute, unforgivable lie now sat gleaming brightly on the screen right in front of me. The ring had never been lost in the frozen rocky ravine. It had never been tragically incinerated in the twisted, burning metal of my son's destroyed vehicle. Todd had personally stripped that priceless, highly sentimental family heirloom directly from my dead son's cold, lifeless body before the Rural Highway Patrol authorities ever arrived at the remote accident scene. He had kept it safely hidden away like a sick, incredibly morbid trophy of his successful assassination. Rachel stared greedily down at the beautiful, shining emerald, letting out a soft, highly excited gasp of pure delight. She eagerly extended her left hand toward her murderous lover, her fingers trembling slightly with intense, completely unadulterated anticipation. She did not display a single ounce of grief, guilt, or moral hesitation. She was happily accepting the stolen, heavily blood-stained ring of her brutally murdered husband from the very man who had violently orchestrated his deeply tragic death. Todd gently picked up the emerald ring between his thick fingers. He slowly, deliberately slipped the magnificent piece of jewelry onto Rachel's extended finger. They paused to admire the brilliant, deep green gemstone gleaming brightly under the harsh industrial lighting. Todd let out a low, incredibly dark, and completely humorless laugh that aggressively rattled the tiny internal speakers of the tactical laptop. He leaned forward, wrapping heavy arms around her waist. He looked down into her eyes, his voice dropping into a sinister, deeply terrifying whisper that echoed with absolute clarity through our hidden surveillance microphone. Todd smiled wickedly, devoid of any basic human empathy, and stated his final, utterly soul-crushing confession. Matthew begged me to pull the handbrake while he was bleeding out. I just turned up the radio. The digital screen instantly went black. I turned off the monitor. The time for investigation is over. It is time for war. I did not scream. I did not throw the heavy laptop against the cheap wood paneling of the motel room, nor did I collapse onto the thin carpet to violently weep for my murdered son. The time for raw, paralyzing grief had officially expired perfectly, replaced by a cold, highly calculating, and absolute necessity for total destruction. I had spent 4 long decades pouring concrete foundations and erecting massive steel frameworks, learning very early on that achieving genuine structural integrity requires immense patience, deliberate planning, and zero emotional interference. When a building is actively collapsing around you, panic is an absolute death sentence. I took a deep, incredibly steadying breath, feeling the freezing winter air fill my aging lungs, and forcefully compartmentalized the overwhelming, suffocating agony tearing at my chest. Jonathan Pierce and Mike Russo watched me in absolute, highly respectful silence, silently waiting for my definitive command. I stared at the dark computer monitor firmly locking the haunting memory of my late wife's vintage emerald ring deep inside my mind, and I simply nodded. We immediately went to work. For the next several agonizing hours, the cramped, poorly lit motel room transformed entirely into a highly disciplined, meticulously organized tactical command center. We did not speak a single solitary, unnecessary word. Mike silently downloaded every single frame of high-definition video and crystal-clear audio from the hidden micro-cameras we had secretly planted inside the massive metal barn. He rapidly created triple-encrypted digital backups on heavy-duty solid-state drives, permanently ensuring that Todd and Rachel's sickeningly arrogant conversations, their highly passionate embraces over stolen industrial machinery, and their incredibly detailed discussions of international shipping logistics were permanently and securely archived. Jonathan worked relentlessly beside him aggressively, finalizing the massive, undeniable digital paper trail. He perfectly compiled the highly illegal offshore banking routing numbers, the completely counterfeit vehicle identification plates, and the heavily documented, highly suspicious wire transfers, directly linking my rapidly draining pension funds to the severely corrupt, deeply disgraced crash investigator. Finally, we forcefully added Arthur Vance's clearly recorded, completely terrified homicide confession to the very top of our sprawling digital pile. We had successfully and surgically isolated every single load-bearing pillar of their incredibly lucrative, blood-soaked criminal syndicate. We possessed the absolute motive, the undeniable method, and the staggering, overwhelmingly irrefutable financial proof of a highly orchestrated, premeditated corporate homicide. The dark foundation of their incredibly complex lies was completely exposed, actively primed, and entirely ready to be violently detonated. But we urgently needed a wrecking ball massive enough to absolutely shatter their carefully constructed world instantaneously. Jonathan closed his thick leather binder and pulled out his highly encrypted cellular phone. As an incredibly ruthless, highly successful corporate attorney, he possessed a sprawling, deeply embedded network of extremely powerful government contacts. He expertly bypassed the local and county authorities, entirely keenly knowing that municipal jurisdictions could easily become severely compromised or endlessly entangled in frustrating, highly restrictive bureaucratic delays. Instead, Jonathan made a direct, highly secure call to a deeply specialized federal task force operating quietly out of the regional government field office. He specifically contacted a senior federal agent explicitly tasked with aggressively dismantling complex, highly lucrative interstate racketeering operations and financially motivated corporate homicides. Jonathan did not mince his extremely carefully chosen words. He calmly, clearly, and methodically laid out the absolute staggering scale of the illegal operation. He detailed the millions of dollars in highly stolen, heavy construction equipment, the beautifully forged offshore warehouse lease agreements drafted explicitly in my name, and the definitive, completely undeniable forensic proof of a deliberately staged, fatal accident. He rapidly sent a heavily encrypted, tightly condensed digital packet containing our primary highly damning evidence directly to the senior federal agent. We sat together in the incredibly quiet, freezing motel room, listening intently to the heavy, suffocating silence as the federal authorities actively verified the overwhelming, undeniable magnitude of the brutal intelligence we had just delivered. Less than 40 long minutes later, the senior federal agent called Jonathan back. The specialized task force was completely and entirely mobilized. The sheer, terrifying weight of our compiled evidence, particularly the brazen, highly calculated murder of a civilian strictly to facilitate an international heavy machinery smuggling ring, had instantly triggered an immediate maximum priority federal response. They were fully prepared to rapidly deploy a heavily armed, highly trained tactical unit to aggressively raid the rural farm property. However, the seasoned senior agent clearly outlined one absolute, strictly non-negotiable strategic requirement for a flawless, legally perfect sting operation: to permanently secure watertight, completely inescapable federal indictments that would successfully lock Todd and Rachel away in a maximum security penitentiary for the entire remainder of their natural lives. The authorities urgently needed to catch them completely red-handed in the exact middle of their massive transaction. The federal agents could not simply raid an entirely empty storage barn or mistakenly arrest a completely ignorant low-level associate. The specialized federal task force strictly required both Todd and Rachel to be physically present inside the massive chop shop at the exact same moment, completely surrounded by the highly stolen industrial loaders actively possessing the freshly forged international shipping manifests, and physically holding the massive, heavily reinforced titanium briefcase filled entirely to the brim with illicitly laundered cash. The federal agents absolutely needed the ruthless masterminds to be completely isolated and totally trapped within their own highly illegal environment. I knew exactly how to successfully deliver them directly to the federal authorities without raising a single suspicion. I reached into the deep pocket of my heavy winter coat and pulled out my personal cellular phone. I urgently needed to quickly feed Rachel the exact, highly specific narrative she desperately wanted and needed to hear. I needed to guarantee she felt completely safe, absolutely confident, and entirely unmonitored for the next 48 hours while they finalized the highly lucrative international transaction inside my dead son's violated sanctuary. I opened my digital messaging application and carefully composed a brief, highly apologetic text message directed specifically to my deeply grieving, incredibly deceitful daughter-in-law. I purposefully crafted the message to sound exactly like a helpless, heavily burdened, and completely ignorant old man politely bowing out of her extremely busy, supposedly stressful schedule. I slowly typed that my much-needed, deeply solitary winter cruise had unfortunately experienced severe, highly unexpected weather delays at the main coastal port. I smoothly informed her that I was currently stranded completely out of the local area and severely delayed from returning to the harsh winter landscape. I firmly assured her that she had absolutely nothing to worry about regarding the rural property, gently instructing her to simply focus entirely on her own quiet, grieving process. I finalized the highly deceptive digital trap by explicitly stating that my cruise is delayed and I won't be back for another week. I pressed the illuminated send button on the screen, permanently sealing their absolute, highly devastating fate. The trap was set perfectly in motion. Right now, the absolute final countdown to their total, inescapable, and legally binding destruction officially begins in the very freezing darkness of this winter night. The freezing winter wind howled across the desolate, snow-covered property, biting viciously at the exposed skin of my face and hands. It was late Friday night, exactly 96 hours since I had sent that highly calculated, deceptive text message to Rachel. The tactical perimeter had been established long before the sun had fully set behind the dark tree line. Mike Russo and Jonathan Pierce were stationed inside a heavily armored, blacked-out mobile command center, positioned discreetly in the dense woods just beyond the main dirt driveway. Surrounding the entire massive steel and concrete structure was a highly specialized, heavily armed federal task force. They were entirely invisible in the freezing darkness, wearing thick white winter camouflage completely blending into the massive snowdrifts, their weapons drawn, and their tactical radios silent. They were waiting patiently for my precise, predetermined signal. I stood alone near the edge of the woodline, staring directly at the brightly lit frosted windows of the massive metal barn I had personally built with my murdered son. I was not wearing my heavy, worn winter work coat or my standard scuffed leather contractor boots. I had deliberately dressed for the occasion. I wore a perfectly tailored, sharp black suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. It was the exact same suit I had worn to Matthew's tragic funeral. I wore it now as a profound, entirely silent testament to the absolute justice I was about to violently extract on his behalf. I stood completely straight, my shoulders pulled back, letting the immense discipline of 4 decades in the commercial construction industry fortify my aging spine. I was no longer the broken, grieving old man they believed they had completely outsmarted. I was the absolute architect of their imminent destruction. Tucked securely under my right arm was the incredibly thick blue legal binder containing every single piece of undeniable, fully documented forensic evidence. It held the high-definition video transcripts, the offshore banking routing numbers, the forged warehouse leases, and Arthur Vance's deeply terrifying, officially sworn homicide confession. The heavy binder felt incredibly dense, a physical manifestation of the immense suffocating grief and raw burning rage I had been quietly carrying for months. The low muffled thumping of loud rhythmic bass music spilled out from the interior of the barn, aggressively vibrating against the cold, corrugated steel walls. They were throwing a private, highly arrogant celebration. The massive $2 million offshore cryptocurrency transfer from the South American syndicate had officially cleared their complex digital firewall just an hour ago. The international shipping containers were perfectly packed, completely loaded, and entirely ready to be swiftly transported to the busy commercial port of Newark under the total cover of darkness. They believed they had won. They genuinely thought they had successfully murdered my only child, stolen my deeply respected professional identity, and fully secured their incredibly luxurious, illicit early retirement. I stepped out of the freezing shadows and walked deliberately across the packed snow of the main driveway. I did not attempt to hide my footsteps. I walked with a heavy, highly authoritative rhythm, marching straight toward the primary aluminum bay doors. I reached the side access entrance and grasped the frozen metal handle. I did not bother to slowly pick the lock or gently ease the heavy door open. I braced my shoulder and violently shoved the heavy steel frame inward with every ounce of my remaining physical strength. The heavy door slammed aggressively against the interior concrete wall with a massive, incredibly loud, echoing boom that instantly shattered the arrogant, celebratory atmosphere inside the chop shop. The freezing winter wind aggressively rushed into the heavily heated space, instantly swirling the loose shipping manifests across the floor. I stepped through the threshold, crossing directly out of the freezing darkness and straight into the blinding, extremely harsh glare of the industrial halogen lights. I stood completely still in the doorway, blocking their only primary exit, radiating an absolute, deeply chilling authority that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Todd and Rachel were standing near the front grille of a massive, heavily stolen black SUV that was currently parked directly in the center of the concrete floor. They were dressed in expensive, tailored winter clothing, clearly fully prepared for their imminent, highly luxurious flight to the tropics. In Todd's left hand was a beautiful, incredibly expensive crystal champagne flute. Rachel was holding a matching glass, leaning comfortably against the dark, polished hood of the stolen vehicle. They had literally been toasting to their own magnificent, blood-soaked victory when I violently breached the heavy door. The loud music continued to pulse through the shop speakers, but the two of them instantly froze, completely paralyzed in absolute, terrifying shock. The color rapidly drained from Todd's face, transforming his usually arrogant, aggressive features into a pale, sickening mask of pure, unadulterated panic. He stared at my perfectly tailored black suit, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy blue binder tightly secured under my arm. Rachel physically flinched. The expensive crystal champagne flute slipped directly through her trembling, perfectly manicured fingers. The delicate glass hit the hard concrete floor, violently shattering into 1,000 tiny, glistening pieces. The bright, bubbly liquid splashed heavily across the toes of her expensive designer boots. For one brief, highly desperate second, pure terror flashed across her widened eyes. But then the deeply ingrained, incredibly sociopathic instinct for total self-preservation instantly kicked in. I watched in absolute silent disgust as she physically rearranged her facial features. She forced her tense, panicked shoulders to completely relax. She rapidly painted a wide, incredibly fake, deeply trembling smile across her face, frantically attempting to pivot directly back into the sweet, highly vulnerable, innocent daughter-in-law persona she had meticulously maintained for months. She took a hesitant, unsteady step toward me, her voice pitching up into a high, artificial tone of manufactured relief. "Dad!" Rachel gasped loudly, throwing her empty hands up in the air in a theatrical, highly exaggerated display of immense surprise. "Oh my God, what are you doing here? I thought you were in Florida. Your text message specifically said the winter cruise was delayed and you would not be back for another entire week." She let out a short, breathless laugh, glancing nervously at Todd, before looking back at my completely hardened, entirely stoic face. "You completely startled us. We were just down here finalizing some of Matthew's old confusing shipping logistics before we packed up the office." She took another slow, calculated step toward me, her fake smile trembling violently at the edges. "Why are you wearing a suit, Dad? Are you okay?" I did not speak a single word. I did not acknowledge her pathetic, highly desperate theatrical performance. I maintained absolute, terrifying eye contact, my gaze burning with a cold, completely unforgiving wrath. I walked slowly, deliberately past Todd's paralyzed, trembling frame. I approached the front of the stolen black SUV. I raised my right arm and simply dropped the massive, thick blue binder directly onto the polished metal hood. The heavy legal document landed with a massive, booming thud that completely silenced the room. The heavy blue binder sat there like a ticking bomb. Todd stared at it, his chest heaving before his greedy hands reached out to slowly flip open the thick cover. He looked down at the very first page. It was a high-definition, perfectly printed photograph of himself and Rachel, completely locked in their passionate embrace over the hood of the stolen bulldozer, captured directly from our hidden ceiling camera just 48 hours ago. Todd flipped to the next page, his hands beginning to shake violently. He saw the meticulously organized bank routing numbers, the highlighted offshore cryptocurrency transactions, and the absolute irrefutable documentation linking his shell company to the South American syndicate. But it was the third page that finally broke his sociopathic composure. It was a fully sworn, heavily notarized copy of Arthur Vance's official confession regarding the intentionally severed brake lines on my son's truck. Todd physically stumbled backward, bumping heavily against the grille of the stolen black SUV. The sheer magnitude of his total exposure crashed down upon him. The beautifully constructed, incredibly lucrative criminal empire he had built upon my boy's grave was disintegrating right before his very eyes. He looked up at me, his face twisting from pale, terrified panic into a mask of pure, unadulterated homicidal fury. He realized in that exact moment that the seemingly clueless, grieving 70-year-old man had systematically dismantled his entire life. Rachel peered over the edge of the binder, her eyes scanning the deeply incriminating documents. She let out a piercing, hysterical scream, backing away from the desk and pressing her back flat against the cold, corrugated steel wall of the barn. Her facade of the helpless widow evaporated entirely, replaced by the raw, animalistic terror of a woman staring directly at a lifelong federal prison sentence. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly rigid, my hands resting calmly at my sides. I did not blink. I did not step back. I looked at the man who had ordered the brutal execution of my son, and I spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that echoed deeply in the freezing, cavernous space. I told him that every single dollar he had stolen was completely frozen by the federal government. I informed him the authorities had already seized the international shipping containers waiting in Newark, and the dangerous South American cartel was completely aware that he had burned their transaction. I wanted him to fully comprehend that he had absolutely nothing left. He had no money, he had no escape route, and he had no future. Todd let out a guttural, terrifying roar of absolute rage. The carefully maintained illusion of the charming, supportive business partner vanished completely. He was a trapped, desperate animal, and his survival instincts demanded violence. He aggressively reached behind his back, shoving aside the heavy fabric of his winter parka, and quickly withdrew a heavy, dark metal handgun from his waistband. He raised the weapon, pointing the dark, trembling barrel directly at the center of my chest. Rachel shrieked again, covering her ears and dropping down into a defensive crouch behind the heavy wooden desk. Todd clicked the safety off with a sharp metallic snap, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though his teeth might shatter. He screamed that I was going to die right here on this freezing concrete floor, just like my pathetic son had died in the snow, and that he would happily burn the entire barn to the ground with my body locked inside. He took a massive, heavy step toward me, his finger tightening visibly on the trigger. I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to protect myself, nor did I utter a single word of protest or fear. I simply stared directly into the dark barrel of his weapon and waited. I had built massive structural foundations that successfully withstood violent hurricanes and devastating earthquakes. I was absolutely not going to break or cower in front of a pathetic coward. Before Todd could close the remaining physical distance between us, the entire perimeter of the freezing rural farm absolutely exploded. A blinding, violently flashing sea of intense red and blue strobe lights suddenly pierced through every single frosted window of the massive metal structure. The deafening, ear-splitting shriek of heavy police sirens instantly shattered the quiet winter night, echoing across the desolate, snow-covered fields with overwhelming, terrifying volume. The sound was so physically powerful that the very ground beneath our boots began to violently vibrate. Todd froze his eyes, darting frantically toward the rattling aluminum bay doors. His attention violently snapped away from me as the crushing reality of the massive ambush finally dawned on his panicked mind. He spun around, desperately searching for a rear exit, the heavy handgun shaking wildly in his grip. But it was far too late. There was absolutely nowhere left to run. A massive, heavily armored black federal tactical vehicle smashed aggressively through the thick wooden gates at the top of the dirt driveway, the roaring engine completely drowning out the loud thumping music still playing inside the chop shop. A second armored unit followed closely behind, tires tearing brutally through the packed winter snow, cutting off any potential escape route entirely. The front of the leading tactical vehicle slammed directly into the primary aluminum bay doors of the barn. The massive metal sheets buckled inward, tearing violently away from their heavy steel hinges with a deafening metallic screech. The cold winter wind howled directly into the building, bringing with it a highly coordinated, heavily armed swarm of elite federal tactical agents. They poured through the completely destroyed entrance in perfect, strict military formation, clad entirely in dark tactical gear, their high-powered assault rifles raised and perfectly targeted. Brilliant white laser sights danced rapidly across the dark industrial machinery, instantly zeroing in on Todd's towering, completely panicked frame. A booming, heavily amplified voice echoed from a massive tactical bullhorn outside, demanding that Todd drop his weapon immediately and fall flat onto the concrete floor. The sheer, overwhelming force of the federal task force was absolute. Todd stood completely paralyzed for one brief, incredibly stupid second, his weapon still hovering dangerously in the freezing air. He looked at the massive swarm of heavily armed agents, then back at me, his face twisting in an ugly mask of pure defeat. He truly realized he was completely outnumbered and entirely outgunned. Before he could even think about firing a single shot, 3 tactical agents charged forward with incredible, terrifying speed. They hit Todd with the immense combined force of a speeding freight train. The heavy metal handgun was violently kicked out of his grip, sliding harmlessly across the slick concrete floor. The agents slammed Todd face first onto the freezing ground. The brutal sound of his face striking the hard concrete echoed sharply. 2 agents piled heavily on top of him, pinning his arms and securing heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Todd groaned in agony, his previous arrogance replaced by the pathetic sounds of a trapped criminal. Rachel fell to her knees, screaming and begging me for mercy, claiming Todd forced her into it. I looked down at the trembling woman, kneeling on the freezing concrete floor, surrounded by the federal tactical team. Her manicured hands were violently wrenched behind her back, secured by cold steel handcuffs. The bright glare of the halogen lights illuminated the streams of black mascara running rapidly down her tear-soaked cheeks. She sobbed hysterically, her voice echoing shrilly against the corrugated metal walls. She wailed that she was an innocent victim, an unwilling pawn manipulated by an unstable man. She swore on my dead son's grave that she never wanted any of this to happen. I did not blink. I did not offer a single word of comfort, nor did I display the slightest trace of empathy. Her frantic manufactured tears were utterly useless against the impenetrable fortress of my burning rage. I knew the absolute truth. I had spent agonizing hours watching the hidden surveillance footage, listening to her calculate offshore profit margins, and enthusiastically plan my psychiatric incarceration. I walked slowly, my posture straight, my polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the slick floor until I stood directly in front of her kneeling frame. The federal agents instinctively stepped back quietly, granting me the undisputed authority of this devastating moment. I did not scream. I simply reached down firmly, grabbing her icy left hand. She let out a sharp gasp, shrinking away from my terrifying silence. Without a single word, I wrapped my calloused fingers around the magnificent gemstone resting on her trembling finger. I forcefully, deliberately pulled the vintage emerald ring straight off her hand. I held the precious family heirloom tightly in my closed fist, feeling the cold metal pressing deeply into my palm. I smoothly slipped the beautiful ring directly into the breast pocket of my tailored black suit, safely returning my late wife's most treasured possession to the exact place where it belonged, directly over my beating heart. Rachel stared up at me, her eyes wide with absolute realization. She finally understood that her innocent widow persona had utterly failed. Todd was violently dragged up from the hard concrete floor by two tactical agents. His face was bruised, a line of dark blood dripping slowly from his busted lower lip, staining the white collar of his expensive winter shirt. His hands were heavily restrained behind his back, his shoulders pinned awkwardly. He glared at me with pure venom, his dark eyes burning with the absolute raging fury of a severely beaten animal. He aggressively spat a stream of violently profane insults in my direction, desperately attempting to reclaim a fraction of his shattered pride. The lead federal agent, an incredibly imposing man wearing a heavy tactical vest, stepped smoothly between us. He ordered Todd to remain completely silent, his voice vibrating with absolute, unquestionable authority. The senior agent turned his focused gaze directly toward me. I turned my back on the bleeding murderer and walked toward the hood of the stolen black SUV. I placed my right hand onto the perfectly organized blue binder. I slowly opened the cover, revealing the meticulously assembled mountain of undeniable, damning forensic evidence. I carefully extracted the perfectly forged, fraudulent medical documents that falsely declared my severely aggressive cognitive decline. I handed the crisp white papers directly to the lead federal agent. I watched his hardened eyes scan the corrupt psychological evaluation. I then pulled out the fully transcribed and heavily notarized digital confession regarding the intentionally severed brake lines on my son's commercial truck. The federal agent accepted the stack of deadly evidence with a respectful nod. He quietly assured me that the specialized task force possessed absolutely everything they needed to permanently secure multiple, completely inescapable life sentences for both conspirators standing before us. They were fundamentally dead inside the eyes of the federal judicial system. The deafening, chaotic sounds of the aggressive tactical raid slowly began to transition into the highly methodical rhythm of a massive federal crime scene investigation. Heavy-duty, flatbed tow trucks began rolling down the dirt driveway, perfectly positioning themselves to impound the millions of dollars in highly stolen, undocumented industrial machinery. Dozens of highly trained forensic technicians swarmed the massive metal barn, meticulously cataloging the counterfeit vehicle identification plates, the highly secured international shipping manifests, and the massive titanium briefcases filled entirely with illicitly laundered cash. The lead federal agent calmly signaled to his tactical team. The heavily armored agents forcefully grabbed Todd and Rachel by their restrained shoulders, roughly marching them directly out of the brightly lit chop shop and straight into the freezing, unforgiving winter darkness. I walked slowly out of the massive aluminum bay doors, standing quietly on the packed snow, and watched the final highly satisfying sequence of their absolute destruction. Rachel was aggressively shoved into the dark back seat of a heavily armored federal cruiser, her piercing screams completely muffled by the thick, bulletproof glass. Todd was violently forced into a separate, highly secured transport vehicle, his towering, once arrogant frame forcefully folded into the cramped, caged interior. The heavy metal doors slammed shut with a definitive, highly resonant finality that echoed loudly across the barren, deeply frozen agricultural fields. The brilliant, violently flashing red and blue strobe lights painted the thick surrounding tree line with harsh, rapidly moving colors. The massive fleet of federal tactical vehicles turned around, their tires crunching loudly against the frozen gravel. I stood perfectly still, my hands resting calmly in my pockets, and watched the intimidating procession of law enforcement vehicles slowly disappear down the dark, rural highway. The blinding emergency lights faded into the distant pitch-black horizon, taking the deeply sociopathic murderers entirely out of my existence forever. The intense chaos of the federal raid completely vanished instantly, replaced by the profound, heavy silence of the rural winter night. The freezing, unforgiving wind swept across the desolate, snow-covered farm, whispering softly through the barren branches of the surrounding frozen trees. I stood entirely alone in the center of the massive dirt driveway. The immense, sprawling empire of greed, absolute deception, and brutal, premeditated murder had been completely and surgically dismantled from the inside out. I reached my freezing right hand deep into the breast pocket of my tailored black suit. My heavily calloused fingers brushed against the smooth, flawless surface of my late wife's vintage emerald ring. The precious family heirloom was finally safe. The massive, heavy burden of absolute vengeance, the raw, explosive fury that had sustained my aging body through weeks of meticulous, dangerous surveillance, slowly began to drain out of my exhausted bones. I looked at the endlessly expansive winter sky, feeling the freezing snowflakes gently landing against my warm cheeks. The deeply corrupt, toxic foundation of their highly lucrative criminal syndicate had been violently, permanently destroyed. They would rot endlessly inside a maximum security federal penitentiary, completely stripped of their stolen wealth and unearned freedom. But as I turned around and stared quietly at the empty metal barn, I truly realized that the hardest part of this devastating journey was not the highly tactical dismantling of their criminal empire. The truth settled heavily upon my shoulders. The deeply profound work of truly honoring my dead son's beautiful, stolen legacy was only just beginning. The freezing winter slowly surrendered to a bright, promising spring. 3 agonizing months passed since that chaotic night, when the massive metal barn was violently raided and my entire world was fractured and reset. The subsequent federal trial was incredibly swift and absolutely merciless. The massive mountain of digital evidence, the highly encrypted offshore banking traces, and the deeply damning homicide confession proved entirely insurmountable for their expensive defense attorneys. Todd and Rachel sat in the quiet courtroom, completely silent, completely stripped of their usual arrogance and deceitful charm. They were both handed consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, permanently locked away in maximum security federal penitentiaries for interstate racketeering and the brutal, premeditated murder of my son. I sat perfectly straight in the front row of the gallery on the day of their sentencing, wearing my sharp black suit, and watched the heavy wooden doors close behind them forever. I felt a tremendous heavy weight physically lift from my shoulders, knowing that absolute justice had finally been served for my only child. I walked out of that federal courthouse holding my head high, ready to rebuild my shattered existence. With the criminal trial officially concluded, I immediately went to work systematically cleansing my son's professional name. I fired their corrupt legal team, took full, undisputed control of the rural farm property, and carefully liquidated every single piece of legitimate heavy machinery. I did not want any of the tainted corporate money touching my family name. Instead, I poured my own remaining funds, the union pension they had so greedily tried to steal, into a completely new foundation. I completely gutted the massive metal barn, ripping out the cold concrete remnants of their highly illegal chop shop. Jonathan Pierce handled the complex legal paperwork, while Mike Russo helped me physically tear down the old interior walls. We worked side by side from sunrise until sunset, sweating through our shirts, replacing the very dark history of that building with genuine positive purpose. In its place, I meticulously constructed a state-of-the-art nonprofit trade school dedicated specifically to teaching commercial construction and heavy machinery operation to troubled youth. I named the institution after my boy, permanently ensuring that Matthew's incredible legacy would be defined by education, hard work, and opportunity, rather than by violent deception and greed. This beautiful morning, I sat quietly on the wide wooden porch of the main farmhouse, holding a warm cup of black coffee in my hands. The loud, rhythmic sounds of power tools, heavy diesel engines, and enthusiastic instructors echoed proudly from the newly renovated barn across the long driveway. It was a beautiful symphony of honest hard work. I took a slow, deep breath of the fresh spring morning air and looked up at the wall directly beside the front door. Hanging perfectly level in a simple black frame was not a prestigious business award or a fancy university diploma. It was a heavily creased, slightly faded piece of standard paper. It was the original electric bill for $523. That single, seemingly insignificant discrepancy had been the absolute catalyst for uncovering the entire blood-soaked empire of lies. It served as a permanent daily reminder to always trust my instincts and to never ignore the smallest structural fracture in a foundation. I am 70 years old now, a man who has weathered the absolute darkest storms of human betrayal, calculated manipulation, and profound, suffocating grief. But as I sat there listening to the bright sounds of a new generation building their futures, I felt a deep, profound sense of calm wash over my aging bones. For the very first time in an incredibly long, agonizing year, I finally felt truly alive, immensely strong, and completely at peace. The foundation is absolutely whole again, permanently fortified by the enduring strength of my beloved only son's memory. Evil often hides behind the most convincing tears and the warmest smiles, manipulating our deepest grief to serve its own insatiable greed. When your intuition screams that something is wrong in the dark, you must bravely find the immense courage to turn on the light, no matter how terrifying the uncovered truth might be. Legal ties genuinely mean absolutely nothing if they are built solely on a toxic foundation of ultimate betrayal. True strength isn't about avoiding immense pain. It is about standing tall when your world shatters methodically, taking back your power, and ensuring justice permanently prevails over deception. Have you ever trusted someone completely only to uncover a chilling betrayal hiding right beneath your nose? How did you successfully find the necessary strength to bravely fight back, please? Share your own personal story in the comments below. Accurately hit that subscribe button and join our active community today.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside leads me home. He taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.